On the 25th of March 1807, the British Parliament passes the Act for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. After nearly 20 years of relentless campaigning by William Wilberforce, Thomas Clarkson and many others, Britain finally outlaws the slave trade. The celebration were huge. After all, the world's largest slave trading nation had just announced that the trade was over. Now, here's the part most people don't know. What exactly did that law do for the millions of enslaved Africans the very day it was passed? Absolutely nothing. It freed nobody, not a single enslaved person. And this is the part that should really make you stop and think. Slavery itself remained completely legal throughout the British Empire for another 26 years. And so, what exactly did Britain abolish in 1807? Why did they later send warships to Africa to enforce that law? And how did the same country that had carried about 3.5 billion Africans across the Atlantic suddenly become the one policing the ocean? Because the answer is far more complicated than the version most of us know. Before we go any further, let's remind ourselves who Britain was at this point. For nearly 200 years, British ships carried more enslaved Africans across the Atlantic than any nation in history. By one careful estimate, around 3.5 billion people. That is roughly 1/3 of the entire Atlantic slave trade. British merchants became incredibly wealthy from it. Entire cities prospered because of it. Liverpool did not become one of the Britain's greatest ports by accident. And where were many of those people taken from? Right here in the present-day Nigeria, this coastline that will one day become southern Nigeria stood at the very center of this trade. To the west, the Bight of Benin exported so many enslaved people that Europeans eventually stopped hiding what it was and simply labeled it the Slave Coast on their maps. That wasn't just a nickname. It actually appeared on European maps. Further east, the Bight of Biafra sent hundreds of thousands more through ports like Bonny, Elem, Calabari, and Old Calabar. And the scale of this trade is honestly difficult to imagine. In just 15 months, around 1820, one British officer counted 190 slave cargoes leaving Bonny. Another 162 left Calabar. Think about that for a second. Not people. Shiploads, hundreds of human beings packed into each vessel, all of that in just 15 months. From only 2 ports. Most of the people forced onto those ships were Igbo and Ibibio, but they did not begin their journey on the coast, and this part is really important. Many were captured hundreds of kilometers inland through wars, slave raids, and outright kidnapping. From there, they were passed from one trader to another, moving along long trading routes until they reached the coast. Behind the Bight of Biafra, much of that traffic flowed through the Aro trading networks and the influence of its famous oracle, the Ibini Ukpabi, drawing captives from across Igbo land towards the Niger Delta. Further west, the wars that eventually brought down the Old Oyo Empire fed thousands more into the same system. In fact, we covered those wars in the very first episode of this series. So, by the time someone finally arrived at Bonny or Calabar, they had often already spent weeks walking in chains. Weeks. And the worst part of the journey hadn't even begun. The Atlantic crossing still lay ahead. That was the trade Britain led. And in 1807, Britain announced it was ending it. So, let us go back to the question we started with. If the 1807 Act did not free anybody, what exactly did it ban? It banned the trade itself, the buying, the selling, the transportation of enslaved people across the Atlantic. But if you already own enslaved people, you kept them. Nothing changed for them. Slavery itself remained perfectly legal throughout the British Empire until another law was passed in 1833. And yet, credit where it is due, Britain did something genuinely remarkable next. After spending 2 centuries building and profiting from this trade, it decided to fight against it, not just within its own empire, but across the Atlantic world. The Royal Navy established what became known as the West Africa Squadron, based at Freetown in Sierra Leone. Its mission was simple, at least on paper: patrol the West African coast, hunt down slave ships, capture them, and free the people crammed into their holds. Over roughly the next 50 years, the squadron captured about 1,600 slave ships and liberated around 150,000 Africans. Now, just stop and think about how extraordinary that change was. The very same Royal Navy that has spent generations protecting Britain's slave ships was now chasing them across the Atlantic. The hunters had become the police. But none of this was easy. This was still the white man's grave we talked about in the last episode. Malaria and yellow fever killed sailors almost as quickly as they arrived. By one estimate, one British sailor died for every 9 captives the squadron rescued. It was one of the deadliest naval assignments in British history. But there was one serious problem. The law had a loophole. For years, a slave ship could only be seized if enslaved people were actually found on board. Think about that for a moment. If you are the captain of a slave ship and you suddenly spot a British warship sailing towards you, what do? Sadly, many captains choose the worst possible options. They threw the captives into the sea, not because they had suddenly become more cruel, they already were. They did it to destroy the evidence. A law written in London with good intentions ended up creating one of the darkest incentives imaginable. Human beings became evidence, and evidence could be thrown overboard. The trade, of course, did not disappear overnight. It simply adapted. It became illegal, it became more secretive, and it shifted to places where British patrols were weaker. Lagos quickly became one of the busiest centers of this illegal trade. The business became so profitable that in 1851, the Royal Navy bombarded Lagos itself and forced Oba Kosoko from power. We will return to that story later in this series because it will become a major turning point in the history of Nigeria. But that brings us to the question almost everybody eventually asks. Why? Why would Britain willingly abandon something that has made it incredibly wealthy for over 200 years? Then after ending it, why spend enormous amounts of money trying to stop everyone else from doing that same thing? The answer isn't as simple as many people think. For years, the explanation most people had was straightforward. Britain developed a conscience. The nation recognized slavery as a terrible evil and chose to end it. That is the version most of us grew up hearing. Then, in 1944, everything changed. A historian from the Caribbean named Eric Williams, who would later become the first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, published a book called Capitalism and Slavery. His arguments completely challenged the traditional story. According to Williams, Britain did not end the slave trade because it suddenly became more moral. Britain ended it because the trade was no longer as profitable as it had once been. In other words, not conscience, but economic. And there is something fascinating about that. It took a black Caribbean historian to ask what now seems like the obvious question. Why would an empire willingly abandon one of its biggest sources of wealth? He asked that question in 1944. More than a century after the abolition of the slave trade. That is how long the traditional story went largely unchallenged. Williams' book sparked one of the biggest debates in modern historical scholarship. Not everyone agreed with him. Historian Seymour Drescher later challenged Williams with evidence suggesting that British slavery wasn't declining when abolition came. If anything, it was still thriving. According to Drescher, Britain actually sacrificed economic interest for moral reasons. Today, most historians agree that the slave trade was still profitable when Britain abolished it. But they also agree that the story is much more complicated than either side first suggested. So, where does this leave us? Probably with the answer history often gives. Both sides were right, at least partly. There was genuine moral conviction. People like William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson spent decades campaigning against the trade because they truly believed it was evil. That movement changed public opinion. It changed parliament and eventually it changed the law. In fact, Some historians have described Britain's campaign against the slave trade as the most expensive humanitarian effort in modern history. That deserves to be acknowledged. But let us also notice what Britain gained. Warships now had a legitimate reason to patrol the West African coast. Britain signed anti-slavery treaties with African rulers. Its navy became a constant presence along shores where British merchants increasingly wanted access to trade. In other words, ending the slave trade also expanded British influence. Power spread along the coast, wearing the respectable language of humanitarianism. That doesn't mean the humanitarianism motives weren't real. It simply means history is rarely driven by one motive alone. So in the end, both things can be true at the same time. Britain's abolition campaign was driven by genuine moral conviction, but it also created opportunities that greatly strengthened British influence in West Africa. Those two ideas don't cancel each other's out. They existed side by side. And if there's one lesson I want you to carry throughout this entire series, it is this: history is rarely black and white. People, governments, and empires often act from more than one motives at the same time. You will see that pattern again and again as we continue exploring how Nigeria came to be. But the West African Squadron left behind something far more important than captured slave ships or naval victories. Its greatest legacy wasn't military, it was human. And that story began with the roughly 150,000 Africans the squadron rescued from its slave ships. Most of those rescued Africans were taken to Freetown in Sierra Leone, and something remarkable happened there. People from dozens of different African societies, speaking different languages and carrying different traditions, suddenly found themselves building a new life together. Many embraced Christianity, many attended mission schools, they learned to read and write in English, some became teachers, others became traders, some became skilled craftsmen, and a significant number of them were Yoruba, people who have been captured during the very wars that destroyed the Oyo Empire. Then, from around the 1830s, many of them began making the journey home, back to Lagos, back to places like Abeokuta, back to towns and communities across Yoruba land. But this time, they weren't returning in chains. They returned as free men and women, as merchants, as teachers, as catechists, as clerks. They brought with them English education, new skills, Christianity, and experience that would profoundly shape the society they re-entered. People along the coast came to know them as the Saro. Remember the name, the Saro, because they are about to become very important in our story. And one of those returning is someone you already know. A Yoruba boy was rescued from a slave ship in 1822 and taken to Freetown. There, he received an education, he embraced Christianity, and he later became known as Samuel Ajayi Crowther. Now, think back to our previous episode. We watched him travel up the river Niger during the 1841 expedition. We watched him survive where so many Europeans died. Well, now you know how he got there. His story did not begin on the Niger, it began aboard a slave ship. That is why I keep saying every episode in this series connects to the next. So don't forget the Saro. They may have been a relatively small community, but the influence they will have on the future of Nigeria was enormous. In many ways, they helped shape the country just as much as some of the British governors we'll meet later. And we will return to the story very soon. Now, Britain had abolished the slave trade, that's fine. But it immediately created another problem, a very practical one. If Britain no longer wanted West African exporting people, then what exactly should West Africa export instead? The abolitionists already had an answer. They call it legitimate commerce. Instead of trading in human beings, Britain wanted African merchants to trade in goods, products that could supply British factories without relying on slavery. And one product will soon rise above all other: not gold, not ivory, not cotton, palm oil. Yes, the same palm oil that is probably sitting somewhere in your kitchen today. That ordinary bottle of red oil will go on to reshape the economy of West Africa and ultimately the history of Nigeria itself. But here's the twist: it is one of the greatest irony of history. Almost nobody saw it coming. The new legitimate trade, the one that was supposed to replace slavery, did not actually end slavery in many parts of West Africa. In some ways, in some places, it made the demand for enslaved labor even greater. And once we get there, we discover that ending the Atlantic slave trade did not end slavery at all. It simply changed its shape. And that is where we are heading next. And honestly, I think it is the most surprising episode in this entire series. If you are just joining us, I would really encourage you to start from the beginning. Watch the nation that formed Nigeria, then how Britain's deadly obsession with the Niger River killed Mungo Park, followed by the white man's grave, which explains why the British were pegged at the coast for years before they were able to move interland. Every episode builds on the last, and together they tell one continuous history. If you have enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Because this is our shared history, and the more we understand it, the better we understand how the Nigeria we know today came to exist. I will see you in the next episode.